going to be presenting to you a little bit of my research on the scope of negation in the Romance languages. So Romance languages like Italian, Spanish, Romanian, French are all genealogical descendants of Latin. And because of that, they share a number of features with each other, namely typological features. Take, for example, robust agreement system, or a masculine-feminine gender dichotomy, a complex inflectional morphology, specifically the verb complex, or similar syntactic structures, and other things like that. However, one major area in which these languages show a bit of divergence from one another is the way in which they express negation, that is, negation structure. In the literature, there exists a claim of double negation, or a notion of double negation. As we can see in Spanish and Italian, there's an expression of a preverbal negation marker, glossed here in red as neg, with a second negative element, glossed as nobody. Similarly, in French and Catalan, we see the preverbal negation marker, neg again, with a second, or in Catalan, even a third negative element in the phrase. So minimally, it does seem that the Romance languages can express double negation. However, it is important here to look specifically at French, because the way in which it expresses negation is slightly different from Spanish, Italian, and Catalan, in that both of its negational elements are glossed by neg. That is, they're both verbal negation elements. They both directly negate the verb. In Spanish, Italian, and Catalan, only one of their elements directly negates the verb, and the other is just a negative element, what we call a negative polarity item. When we're talking about Romance negation, it's really important to make a distinction between these two. So let's talk a little bit more about verbal negation in particular, specifically with respect to the Jefferson cycle. So Jefferson in 1917 suggested that for languages like the Romance languages, which initially express verbal negation pre-verbally, this is in contrast to, say, the Germanic languages, which initially express negation post-verbally, as in English, I am not, giving you an example right now. Post-verbal negation. In the Romance languages, this is pre-verbal initially. So the Jefferson cycle is a three-stage process in which pre-verbal negation comes to be replaced by a post-verbal negation marker. Stage 1, initial, the pre-verbal negation marker is expressed in isolation. In stage 2, there's a simultaneous expression of a pre-verbal negation marker and a post-verbal negation marker. The characteristic aspect of stage 2 is that the expression of these two is very rigid. They are expressed together in all situations of negation. Stage 3, the final stage, sees the omission of the pre-verbal negation marker in favor of the post-verbal negation marker. Again, it's important here to distinguish between a verbal negation particle, like what we're talking about in the Jefferson cycle, and those negative items that we saw on the previous slide, negative polarity items, such as nessuno, which is nobody in Italian, or rien, which is nothing in French. Here I propose a template for Romance negation. As we've seen, there are two types of negational elements in the phrase, a negative polarity item and a verbal negational particle. These two, in the Romance languages, can be used in concord or together for emphasis, to emphasize certain parts of the phrase that they wish to negate. So, in this template, there are two slots for verbal negation, in red, a pre-verbal slot and a post-verbal slot, and for the negative polarity items in blue, there's a subject position and an object position. This template constrains the possible expressions or configurations of negation with these two negation elements in concord in the Romance languages. Here, because I'm interested in the scope of negation in Romance languages and not just verbal negation, I was interested in putting these two categories in concord with each other. So initially, I was interested in a negative polarity item in subject position and a pre-verbal negation marker. In this example, the base phrase is nobody wants it. In analyzing these four languages, three distinct behaviors began to emerge, or three classes. In Italian and Spanish, we see that a negative polarity item in subject position and a pre-verbal negational particle can crucially not be expressed at the same time, as illustrated here by the ungrammaticality of those two being expressed. Instead, Italian and Spanish can express a negative polarity item in subject position, or a pre-verbal negation particle, and then a negative polarity item in object position, as seen on the right there by non lo vuole nessuno for Italian. In class 2, we see a slightly different behavior, with Catalan crucially having to express both a negative polarity item in subject and a pre-verbal negation marker. If the pre-verbal negation marker is omitted, like in Italian and Spanish, the phrase is crucially ungrammatical. And if the negative polarity item is omitted in favor of the pre-verbal negation marker, the semantics of the phrase change. It would no longer be nobody wants it. Interestingly, class 3, French, can pattern like both class 2 and class 1, in that it can express both the negative polarity item and the preverbal negation marker, personne ne, like Catalan, or it can pattern like class 1 and omit the preverbal negation marker, as seen on the bottom right in personne le veut. That pattern's like class 1. Here, I wanted to expand the configuration by adding a negative polarity item object position to our previous configuration. Here, the base sentence is nobody said anything. Again, we have these similar three classes. In Italian and Spanish, as we saw previously, a negative polarity item in subject position and a preverbal negation particle cannot coexist. So this is somewhat of an impossible configuration. However, that's not to say that semantically speaking, these languages cannot express nobody said anything. Instead, the preverbal negation marker is omitted, and a negative polarity item in subject and object position are expressed in concord with each other, as seen here and here, to express semantic meaning. Catalan patterns similarly to the previous slide in that all three elements crucially must be expressed to express the same semantic meaning. If the preverbal negation particle is omitted, grammaticality would be compromised, and if either of the negative polarity items were omitted, semantics would change. Again, similarly, French can pattern as either of these two classes, with the expression of all three elements like Catalan, or the omission of the preverbal negation particle like Italian and Spanish. As I suggested earlier, we can try to describe the negation of the Romance languages according to the three stages of the Jefferson cycle. As we can see by the egregiously large block in the post-verbal negation section of the table, all four languages express characteristics that exemplify stage 1 of the Jefferson cycle. That is, the expression of a preverbal negation in isolation. A couple things to take away from this data. Italian and Spanish are very clearly stage 1 of the Jefferson cycle, in that they only express a preverbal negation marker and not a postverbal negation marker. So also, the preverbal negation marker and the negative polarity item subject position can't work together. You can express one or you can express the other, but not both. French expresses behaviors that exemplify all three stages of the Jefferson cycle, actually, because we see in personne ne le veut just the expression of a preverbal negation marker without the postverbal negation marker, the expression of both ne and pas in nous n'avons pas, and then the expression of just the postverbal negation marker, the third stage of Jefferson cycle here in nous avons pas. Interestingly, Catalan, while it seems to pattern as a stage 1 of the Jefferson cycle, in that it doesn't express postverbal negation in conjunction with the preverbal negation, it seems to have some behaviors that suggest that it may be acting like a stage 2 language. Because, as I suggested earlier, stage 2 languages are characterized by the rigidity of their negation. In Catalan, negation seems to be much more rigid than Italian and Spanish, in that we see the preverbal negation marker in all three of these examples. And in Italian, where the negative polarity item in subject position can express all the negation of a phrase, Catalan crucially must have concord between the negative polarity item and preverbal negation, which, again, suggests that it's slightly more rigid and might be acting like stage 2. In conclusion, double negation in the Romance languages is a bit of a misnomer. Really, only French expresses true double negation if we define negation according to verbal negation and by the Jefferson cycle, specifically with respect to stage 2, where a preverbal and postverbal particle are stage 2 and double negation. Really, what appears to be double negation in the literature is just concord between a verbal negational particle and a negative polarity item working together to place emphasis on a specific area, or just two negative polarity items, like we saw in Spanish and Italian. And that is my presentation on Romance.
Is the Jefferson cycle only with Romance languages?
No, not at all. No, it's for any language that expresses negation preverbally. Yeah.
So you said French is in stage 2. Isn't there an example where there isn't a pre-verbal?
Whether it's, yeah. So,
How can it be
yeah.
stage 2?
So like here, this is stage 2 because it has a pre and post verbal, but also it acts like stage 3 because the preverbal particle today has been analyzed as not carrying as much negative weight. So the post-verbal particle now carries most of the like negative weight in the phrase. So the pre-verbal negational particle can be omitted in colloquial French. So it's technically stage 2 because we still see the expression of those two in conflict with each other, but you can express just the post-verbal.
When you, like, when you look at historical French, do you see that there's just the pre-verb?
Yeah, you do. The pas actually, it was among a class of other words. Pas actually means step. There are other words that could be used as emphasis to emphasize negation later in the phrase, like point or something. So this literally would have translated to not a step. And then the step was just reanalyzed as a negation marker. Yeah.
It started. It's still along that line. So when a language moves into stage 2 of the Jefferson cycle, is it usually something like this where you have a lot of craziness happening and it's like sort of unstable, where maybe people want to prefer one or the other? Was nut like preferred before and maybe we're like shifting out, or do you think they're like on their way out at stage 2? Like how do you like explain it?
It's kind of hard.
You can't.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't know all of it, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because, I mean, slight astray, but French, you see some of the relic of pre-verbal negation, like in personne de verb. It looks like pre-verbal negation is still there,
Yeah.
but it can be omitted optionally, but you can do that in Italian and Spanish too, which are pre-verbal negation markers. So we really don't know if it has been completely reanalyzed and then the no can be omitted because it doesn't seem like it's bearing like the negational weight, or if it's the personne is actually like doing the work like in Spanish and Italian.
So like, do you think it's normal for a language to shift from the second to the cycles and third like over time? Is that like
Yeah.
something?
I mean, definitely, yeah. And like what I meant to say is that the 3 stages aren't necessarily like you're in this one and then you're in this one.
Right.
And then you're in this one. Yeah, because like I said, French exhibits behaviors from all 3. Yeah. Because because French.
Dr. Klein?
Yes. I have seen people analyzing morphologically when they pas as a circumfix.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if that potential to be transformed possibly into bound morpheme has some impact here, or if that's even a thing.
The bound, I'm not really sure if bound is true. I mean, I have also seen it discussed as a circumfix, but I would argue it's probably not a circumfix just because it can be written or spoken without the n, and like it doesn't change semantic meaning or compromise grammaticality at all. And so, yeah, it like maybe a clitic, but I don't think it would be a circumfix at all, and especially not coded in. Yeah.